Ah, yes, the Soviet Union, land of snow, slogans, and standing in line. Lots and lots of line. You wanted bread? Stand in line. You wanted shoes? Stand in line. You could adopt the classic Soviet shopping strategy of putting one of everything in your basket. This way you'd always have something to take home. The downside of this approach, however, was that you might end up with an assortment of goods that would make a pirate blush. And don't even get us started on the Soviet specialty stores. Oh, those bad boys were reserved for special occasions and required special treatment, like knowing someone who knew someone who could get you in. These stores sold all kinds of fancy imported goods that were otherwise impossible to find. But be warned, prices were higher than a giraffe, backside, and the selection was as random as a babushka's button box. You wanted to stand in line? We're talking about the long-term state-sponsored projects that supplied the USSR with everything it needed, like 5-year plans for shoe production. Yes, right shoes would be made eventually, but in the meantime, you'd have to make do with whatever you could find on the black market. To survive in this shopping environment required skills, cunning, and a good pair of shoes. Well, congratulations, comrade, you're already doing great. Life in the USSR was an everyday game of guess what's available today, and spoiler alert, it was usually disappointment. From Moscow to Minsk, the economy was centrally planned, which sounds cute until you realize it meant a group of guys in suits decided how many left shoes to make for the whole country. Right shoes? Maybe next year. Stores often had shelves filled with the eerie silence of empty space, and customers learned to become expert scavengers. The trick was to grab first, ask questions later. Because if there was a crowd gathering, it meant something was being sold. And yet, somehow, everyone survived. The black market thrived in alleyways, and whispers and babushkas became tactical bartering experts. It was less about shopping, more about strategy. In this world, a banana was not a fruit, it was a legend. And so we bring you this public service announcement from the Ministry of Getting Things Done. First things first. The best time to shop is in the early morning when new deliveries arrive. This also meant being the first in line, a coveted spot that required arriving before sunrise. Armed with a list of approved items, Soviet shoppers would patiently wait for their chance to enter the store, because remember, punctuality was a virtue. So don't push, don't shove, just stand in line and wait your turn. Oh, and did we mention the line? It wasn't just any line, it was a Soviet line. A carefully organized queue of people standing shoulder to shoulder, shoulder to elbow, murmuring the latest potato jokes while contemplating the mysteries of the empty shelf. Once inside, the experience was like a game of musical chairs. Shoppers would quickly scan the aisles for the elusive item and then sprint to the checkout, hoping they wouldn't be replaced by someone else while they waited. Now, if you were lucky enough to live near a worker's paradise, aka grocery store with a reliable supply, and let's not forget the ultimate test of patience, the 5-year plan. No, not that kind of plan. The USSR was a strange and fascinating place. Everything about it was extreme. Its leaders were either beloved or terrifying. Its breadlines could be both exhilarating and terrifying. And its apartment buildings were, well, bizarre is the only word that comes to mind. So today we're going to explore housing in the USSR with a particular focus on the communal apartments known as communalka. Well, imagine you're playing the game. How many people can we fit into one building? The answer is all of them. Communal apartments were basically the Soviet Union's version of dormitories or shared housing. In fact, many of them were located in buildings that once housed migrant workers. There was always at least one loud neighbor who played their music at full blast, no matter what time it was. For one thing, they were usually located in central areas close to shops, schools, and public transportation. This made it convenient for residents to run errands or commute to work. Plus, you never had to worry about being lonely. There was always someone around. In fact, it was nearly impossible to avoid your neighbors. Would you have enjoyed living in a communal apartment in the USSR? Let me know in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. Whether you wanted to or not, you were part of a community, a big dysfunctional family. And for many Soviet citizens, that was home. The gossip queen who knew everyone's business and the one guy who never returned your sugar. We've all been there. The constant activity and interaction with neighbors created a sense of camaraderie. It was like living in a big city, always surrounded by people, always with someone around to lend a hand or offer a listening ear. In a way, it was a microcosm of Soviet life itself. People were crammed together in close quarters, sharing limited resources and relying on each other for support. The communal bathrooms were also a hub of activity. It was the place where neighbors caught up on each other's lives, exchanged secrets, and made plans. The cramped conditions and lack of privacy could be challenging, but they were a fact of life in the Soviet Union. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s that the government began to address the housing shortage and build more apartments. As the economy improved and people had more money, they began to move out of communal apartments and into their own private spaces. Today, communal apartments are much less common, but they are still a part of the cultural landscape. In fact, many residents preferred to do their business in the communal bathrooms rather than in the privacy of their own homes. They were made up of a series of small rooms, typically with shared kitchen and bathroom facilities. And instead of a roommate, you got an entire sitcom cast of unrelated characters. I'll explain. Now, before we get started, a quick content warning. This video contains descriptions of cramped living conditions, which might be upsetting to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Okay, let's begin. Communal apartments were a staple of housing in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So what exactly were they? In these apartments, families were assigned a room or sometimes two if they were very lucky or very loyal to the Communist Party. There could be anywhere from 4 to 12 unrelated people living together in one apartment. Families would share a kitchen equipped with a single gas stove and a communal bathroom down the hall. Residents would often have to wait in line for hours just to take a shower or use the toilet. Can you imagine? The neighbors would know your business because you'd have to yell across the apartment to get their attention. Privacy was non-existent. Doors were flimsy and walls were paper-thin. You could hear everything from your neighbors' conversations to their fights to the sounds of their daily routines. It was like living in a fish tank. And speaking of noise, silence was a luxury in communal apartments. There was always something going on. Children would run and play in the hallways while parents cooked meals in the communal kitchen. The constant chatter and activity made it nearly impossible to get a moment's peace and quiet. But perhaps the most memorable aspect of communal apartments were the residents themselves. In any given communal apartment, you could find a colorful cast of characters. Communal apartments were not without their advantages, however. Believe it or not, some people actually enjoyed living in communal apartments. Of course, communal apartments were far from ideal, so what do you think? Did you know that school in the USSR wasn't just about learning, it was brainwashing? Oh yeah, and I mean everything. One teacher told me that during an average day in his 5th grade class, they would cover between 3 and 4 topics, including geography, history, literature, art, music. To keep those young minds sharp and enthusiastic, the government made sure that every child had access to the best education in the world. Learning about the glorious history of the Communist Party and the contributions of great communist thinkers. Art class was a blast. We spent weeks drawing tractors and other farm equipment because, there's nothing more exciting than a good old John Deere, and music class was filled with rousing renditions of socialist anthems that celebrated the joys of living in a worker's paradise, or at least that's what they said. And maybe even some algebra? I'll never forget the day my teacher let us read a book under our desks. It was intense, uniform, and yes, very, very boring. But hey, at least everyone graduated with a strong grasp of Marxist theory and the ability to recite Lenin-esque quotes with dead-eyed enthusiasm. That was the whole point of the system, really. It wasn't about teaching us anything. It was about breaking us down and molding us into the kind of mindless automatons that the Soviet Union needed to function. And in that, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. It was an old copy of Don Quixote that somehow made its way into the school library. I don't remember much of the story, but I do remember feeling pretty brave reading those pages under my desk. I felt like I was sneaking around, like I was doing something I wasn't supposed to. And maybe that That's why I remember it so clearly, because it was the only time I can remember actually enjoying school. But don't think for a second that these teachers were all about that student-centered learning. We learned about the horrors of the gulag and the purges and the fact that our parents could be sent to one of those places just for sneezing the wrong way. At least that's what I think we learned. I honestly can't remember much of anything from those classes. All those years of schooling, and all I can come up with is a vague sense of dread and a few nightmares about being chased through the hallways of my elementary school by a faceless bureaucrat holding a clipboard. They were strict, sometimes terrifying, and always on the lookout for any sign of trouble. As soon as those little capitalist bastards could talk, they were indoctrinated into the glories of Lenin and the wisdom of Marx, a paramilitary youth organization for children ages 8 to 14. Every child had to join when they entered school and wear a red scarf with the communist star pinned to it. It was basically the communist version of Boy Scouts, except instead of earning badges for hiking and making s'mores, members of the Young Pioneers earned medals for quote, tireless work and study and mastering the skills of communism. They also spent lots of time memorizing propaganda and reciting speeches by Lenin and other communist leaders. It was like a never-ending game of 20 questions where the answer was always the party was right. To them, school was like a second home where they learned that capitalism was basically the devil wearing a necktie. Every morning, kids would start their day with patriotic songs and speeches about the greatness of the Soviet Union. They were taught that the Communist Party was like a big, happy family and that Uncle Joe Stalin was just a benevolent father figure who cared about their well-being. But asking if it was? Big mistake. You wouldn't graduate from high school with honors, my friend. If you were caught with your pants down around your ankles, you'd better have a good excuse, because denims were rationed and every stitch had to be accounted for. He was never, ever mentioned again after first grade. After that, it was off to class where teachers would drone on about everything from the evils of capitalism to the importance of following orders. Asking why the Soviet Union was the greatest country in the world was encouraged. And then there were the Young Pioneers, but hey, at least they weren't bored. That was the whole point of the system, really. I remember spending hours in the library, poring over state-approved textbooks. Of course, we were also taught about the evils of capitalism, how it led to poverty, inequality, and war. There was one bright spot in all that gloom, though. The rest of it was just a blur of memorizing, reciting, and hiding books under my desk. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. If you worked in the Soviet Union, your job wouldn't be a career, it would be a fate. A twist of the Central Committee's collective nose would send you stacking steel girders, making shoes, or filing insurance claims. Your life expectancy depended on how many bolts you screwed in. The government decided what you got to do and when you got to do it. Which sounds like a fun Russian word for cleaning up after your dog, but it wasn't. It was a work day, which meant no pay and a fine of 2 days' pay if you didn't show up. But Subotniks weren't about cleaning, they were about obedience. The state took a day to remind you that you lived in a totalitarian state. After all, if you didn't pick up trash for a free 1 day a month, you probably wouldn't pick up your own ass off the floor, which was bad for morale and even worse for the party. If you were an accountant at a clothing factory, people found ways to bond with coworkers over mutual misery, invented jokes to cope with crushing monotony, and listened to smuggled Western music on tape decks hidden behind Lenin busts. Some people even managed to stay productive, producing some of the best vodka, shoes, and tractors the world has ever seen. But most people couldn't really get into their work. I mean, why would they? The point of a job was to put bread on the table and maybe get a slightly nicer apartment. It wasn't about creating great works of art or industry. It wasn't about chasing a dream. It was about chasing a quota. And if you made enough of those, well, maybe you'd get lucky and get promoted. Maybe your shift started at 7 a.m. sharp and ended at 3:30 p.m., with an hour break for a bigoted canteen lunch that cost about a third of your monthly salary. You didn't get paid overtime unless you volunteered for an extra shift, which was basically mandatory. To get ahead in the workplace, you needed to get in with the right people. Unlike the capitalist West, promotions weren't based on merit. Connections to people in the Communist Party or the Communist Youth League were the only way to move up, which is why everyone from factory workers to policemen to shop assistants had a second full-time job, kissing ass. Kissing ass. Workplace meetings began with 15 minutes of mindless pledges to the motherland, followed by a recitation of statistics from a folder no one opened. Managers spent the whole time nodding sagely, occasionally asking questions no one could answer, then went home with the statistics folder unopened. There were promotions based on performance, but they were called something else. We call them firing. In the Soviet Union, there were a few coveted positions that came with generous benefits, like being in charge of health and safety. Yeah, that makes sense. If you held one of these positions, you got to make sure everyone at the plant was safe, which meant getting drunk at lunchtime. Even if they were going into a doomsday device or, a shoe. Factory work was king in the Soviet Union. Everyone had to produce. It didn't matter if you were a welder, shoemaker, professional complainer, or member of the Politburo. Your one priority was hitting quotas. And don't think for a second that subtlety saved you. Whether you were working in a collective farm or a factory, your output was measured, counted, and recounted. Those who did and pull their weight were publicly shamed, and those who did were rewarded with extra rations of bread, maybe a new tractor for the collective or an apartment with 5 rooms for the family. The system incentivized people to shirk. So managers hired slackers. They knew that come payday, their cut of the profits wouldn't depend on how much work was done, just how much paperwork was filled out. Soviet jobs were also incredibly rigid. And once a month, every worker had to spend Saturday cleaning up the city or countryside. These were called subotniks, but all this structure, all this pressure created a unique Soviet workplace culture. It's 1978 and you're a Soviet citizen. You've spent your day making cement and pretending that you love it. Now it's time to unwind. How do you do it? Movies were mostly black and white war epics, heroic leaders, or ballet. And this had about 2 channels. One might be showing a tractor documentary, the other a political speech. They were like Reader's Digest, only less funny. Jokes were risky business. People got arrested for making jokes. Even the police had a joke. I used to be a history professor. Don't ask me why I stopped. Anyway, thanks for watching. When they came to arrest someone, they said they were taking them for a ride in the police car. That was the setup. The punchline was, you won't get out alive. There were even jokes about the secret police. Knock, knock, who's there? Police. I wasn't expecting anyone. That was the joke. It implied that the police were such a nuisance that you wouldn't even answer the door. They called it the Committee for the Protection of Socialist Gains. It was basically propaganda disguised as news. Behind closed doors, they made fun of the government, the police, the endless lines. It was the way to survive under the totalitarians. It was the last free thing left. Humor. That's why they say laughter is the best medicine, because it's the second best revenge. Like a modern Russian channel, but without the hot babes. Radio was heavily monitored, but if you were lucky, and I mean really lucky, and bold, very bold, you could catch the BBC World Service, Radio Free Europe, or Voice of America. The music was great, but you had to be careful when you turned it off. You never knew who was listening. Footsteps, better change the subject. We were talking about tractors, right? Oh, and lots of propaganda, especially about space. Everyone looked deeply miserable except Yuri Gagarin. He was always smiling. Imagine a sad Volf in gray animation chasing a rabbit in gray animation. That was their version of Tom and Jerry. Bugs Bunny was a Jewish communist, so naturally he didn't make it into the USSR, but Mickey Mouse did. He became a tailor. I'm not kidding. Check this out. Mickey Mouse works as a tailor in a Soviet cartoon. His buddy Pluto is a dog, but that doesn't stop Mickey from drinking vodka and smoking a pack a day. Go figure, that was Soviet entertainment, fun with a side of dysfunction. Why? Because he knew the party line about being the first human in space. It made him a hero of the Soviet Union. But everyone else in the space films looked miserable. Maybe because they knew it was a lie. Well, you enter the world of Soviet entertainment, fun filtered through 5 layers of bureaucracy. First, there was the Communist Party, All art had to serve the state. So no decadent Western movies, no decadent Western music. There was also television. Children had cartoons, yes, but these were often more depressing than cheerful. The official newspapers had jokes, but they were mostly about work and the government. Still, people danced and sang and gathered for tea and laughed, especially at the system. I'm the author of a book about the secret police in the Soviet Union, and I have a confession to make. In the Soviet Union, trust was a luxury few could afford. Even lovers and family members were suspect. So how did anyone get through those years without losing their mind or worse, getting arrested? I'm the host, and this is our series. Today we're talking about trust, or rather the lack of it in the former Soviet Union. That's roughly the same number as the entire population of Ireland. These agents infiltrated every aspect of public life. The neighbors, the work colleagues, even family members. When everyone is a potential threat, no one is safe. One way was to keep secrets close to the chest. This wasn't just a matter of protecting oneself, but also of protecting others. Friendships were forged in the shared experience of living under the boot of the state. Lovers risked everything to be together. If you couldn't trust the authorities, then you had to trust your friends to keep your secrets. This created a culture of discretion where people were careful about what they said or did in public. It also meant that personal information was kept private, reducing the risk of being denounced or blackmailed. Many people yearned for a different world where trust was possible. However, the scars of those years remained, shaping the way people from this region approach relationships and trust to this day. Meeting in secret and whispering sweet nothings into one another's ears. People risked their own safety to help others escape the country, often using false documents or hiding items. Smuggled goods were passed from hand to hand, creating a network of trust and obligation. Families created their own private spheres where they could be honest and open with each other. It shaped the way people interacted with each other and with the state, but it also fostered a sense of community and resilience. People learned to rely on each other for support and understanding in a world where the authorities could not be trusted. By keeping quiet, people avoided becoming a target. Of course, this came at a cost. Living in a world of secrets took its toll on people's mental health. Many turned to alcohol or simply retreated into themselves. In this atmosphere of suspicion, trust became a rare commodity. Others found ways to express their true feelings through art, literature, or music. Still, some found humor in the absurdity of their situation. Underground jokes, called anecdote, were a popular way of coping with the Soviet system. These jokes mocked everything from the leaders to the mundane aspects of everyday life, such as toilet paper shortages. Telling these jokes was a way of bonding with others who understood the humor and the danger. Laughter became a subversive act of resistance. It may not have changed the system, but it did provide moments of joy in an otherwise bleak existence. They monitored citizens, planted informants, and fabricated evidence. Under such constant surveillance, privacy was an illusion. People lived in fear of being denounced and sent to a labor camp. The Soviet Union was built on a foundation of secrets. Citizens were spied on, neighbors denounced each other, and even children betrayed their parents. Trust was a weakness and paranoia was a virtue. We are also interested in your stories. How did people show trust or betrayal in your family? What did trust look like in your country? Share your stories with us in the comments below. And if you like this video, please support us. The KGB, the main political police force of the USSR, employed over 2 million people at its peak in the 1980s. But it wasn't just the KGB that citizens had to watch out for, it was everyone. We have our own story to tell about growing up in that time and place when you could not trust anyone, not even your best friend. So how did people cope with this lack of trust? Some sought solace in religion, finding strength in their faith. Despite the pervasive distrust, people still managed to form bonds of trust, however tenuous. One way people maintained trust in these relationships was by keeping secrets. But trust was not always enough. Sometimes you had to go to great lengths to protect your loved ones. This lack of trust permeated all aspects of life in the former Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell and the Iron Curtain was lifted, The 1980s, a time of big hair, big dreams, and big problems. For the Soviet Union, by this point, the system was fraying. Shortages got worse. Lies became too big to believe. Even the concrete started cracking. So, in 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev came up with a brilliant solution. How about some fancy new words to make everything sound better? Enter perestroika and glasnost. Glasnost means openness and perestroika means restructuring. It doesn't mean we're gonna fix things because we're not. We're just gonna pretend we are. And it almost worked. At first people loved it. That meant no big changes, no capitalism, just a little openness here, a little restructuring there. In theory it sounded great. In practice it led to total chaos. After all, for 74 years the Communist Party had been in power. It was like living under a volcano. You knew it would erupt someday, but you never knew when. He wanted to steer his country toward democracy and capitalism, but it was a bumpy ride. There were protests in the streets, assassinations in the parliament, and when it fell, it gave birth to a new Russia. Was it the Russia of today? Well, that's a story for another time. Once Yeltsin ordered troops to storm a building and they accidentally killed one of their own. But now it was over and people were left wondering what happens next. They could talk about their problems, complain about shortages, even criticize the government. And the government loved it. By 1993, 96% of Russia's millionaires were self-made. That's right. Overnight, capitalism came to Russia and it looked a lot like looting. Shops were ransacked. Factories were seized. People fought in the streets. It was like the Wild West, except with more vodka. They could take credit for all the new freedoms while still keeping a tight grip on power. Like an onion, it was a clever idea, but it was also a lie. Beneath the surface, everything was still rotten. Gorbachev wanted to fix the Soviet Union without upsetting the socialist order. The Soviet economy was a disaster. Factories couldn't make enough of anything, especially food. His policies advisor once said, "We took the top off the bottle, but we forgot to take the label off." The label, of course, was communism. But don't worry, this story has a happy ending. Kind of. People lined up for hours every day just to buy the basics. But now they could talk about it. All those years of communist rule had made Soviets suspicious of each other. If your neighbor had a slightly nicer apartment, you assumed he got it by selling shoelaces to the black market. You never smiled at strangers because they might be KGB, but then something changed. When the government fell, people discovered they didn't trust each other, not even a little bit. Oh, the humanity. Remember those travel posters from the 70s promising exotic vacations in the workers' paradise? Yeah, those were lies too. Not even the fancy new vodka could drown out the truth. The Soviet Union was falling apart. Gorbachev's reforms only made things worse. In 1991, the whole thing collapsed and the Soviet Union ceased to exist. But before that, something interesting happened. It was the end of an era. Suddenly, everyone was speaking freely. Like when? Historian Timothy Garton Ash asked a Russian journalist what it was like to live under communism. She replied, "It's like living in a prison where you don't know who the guards are or who the prisoners are." But who shot first? When the Berlin Wall fell, people in East Germany celebrated with burgers and a band called the Rolling Stones. But back in the Soviet Union, people weren't so sure. Sure, they hated communism, but what comes after? Capitalism. Barbarism. Years of propaganda had taught them to fear the West. Anything could happen now. The worst thing, freedom. People didn't know what to do with it. By 1993, 85% of Russians thought communism was a bad thing, but change can be scary. Some Russians found the answer in the streets. At the time, Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia. But slowly things settled down. The constitution was rewritten, elections were held, new businesses popped up. Even old communists could become capitalists. In 1996, Time magazine declared, "The New Russian." And yes, it was a capitalist. Who was the new Russian? Anyone. It was the guy selling hot dogs outside the subway. It was the babushka selling homemade pickles. It was the oligarch with the yacht. It was the factory worker whose boss had just been replaced by an American. Basically, it was anyone who could get ahead in the new Russia. Was it easy? No. Was it fair? Debatable. But was it free? Yes. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed because it couldn't keep up with the capitalist world.